What would you do if a single act of kindness could change your life forever? When a 16-year-old boy saves a millionaire's pregnant wife on a busy street, he doesn't expect anything in return. But what happens next will leave you speechless. Life-changing offers, hidden struggles, and a bond that crosses worlds. Stay tuned for a story of courage, hope, and redemption that will tug at your heartstrings. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Ethan Coleman tugged at the frayed straps of his backpack as he quickened his pace down the narrow sidewalk. The early morning sun cast long shadows over Cedar Lane, a street that marked the invisible line between Asheville's working-class neighborhoods and its wealthy districts. On one side stood modest, aging homes like his own. On the other loomed glass-walled office buildings and manicured lawns that seemed a world apart. His sneakers scraped the pavement as he passed a bakery, the scent of freshly baked bread momentarily distracting him from the rumbling in his stomach. Breakfast was a luxury he'd skipped again. There wasn't enough left in the fridge for both him and his 10-year-old sister Lily. His lips tightened at the thought of her frail face and persistent cough. She needed her strength more than he did. Ethan turned onto Cedar Lane, his eyes automatically scanning the street for the familiar blur of shiny cars and briskly moving professionals. As always, he felt out of place, a shadow moving through a world of light. His well-worn hoodie and patched jeans seemed to draw glances from the polished faces hurrying past, though no one said a word. Then he saw her. A woman stood by the edge of the sidewalk, her hands gripping the corner of a gleaming black SUV. Her breath was uneven, her face flushed red. Ethan slowed his steps. She was pregnant, very pregnant, and looked as though the weight of the world were pressing down on her. For a moment, Ethan hesitated. The voices in his head clashed. "Don't get involved," warned one, echoing his mother's constant refrain. Trouble had a way of finding people like him when they least needed it. But another voice, softer but insistent, urged, "She needs help. You can't just walk away." Before he could make up his mind, the woman swayed. Her knees buckled, and she crumpled to the ground. "Hey!" Ethan shouted, running toward her. His voice felt small against the indifference of the street. The people nearby, business people, joggers, a delivery driver, paused for a fraction of a second, glanced at the scene, then continued on their way. Ethan dropped to his knees beside her. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" he asked, his heart pounding. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused. Sweat glistened on her forehead and her breath came in shallow gasps. "Water, please," she whispered. Ethan glanced around, hoping for someone, anyone, to step in. "Can somebody help?" he called out, but his voice was swallowed by the noise of the street. A man in a suit slowed down, his expression wary, but after a moment, he hurried away. Ethan clenched his teeth and shrugged off his backpack, fumbling for the dented water bottle he always carried. He unscrewed the cap and held it to the woman's lips, helping her take a sip. She nodded weakly in thanks, but her condition still seemed dire. "What's your name?" Ethan asked, trying to keep her conscious. He remembered reading somewhere that you had to keep people talking in situations like this. "Margaret." "Maggie," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Okay, Maggie. Help's coming, okay?" Ethan promised, though he had no idea if it was true. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone to call 911. "Hey!" a sharp voice barked, startling him. Ethan looked up to see a uniformed security guard striding toward him, his face set in suspicion. "What are you doing? Step away from her." Ethan's stomach sank. The guard's hand hovered near his belt where a radio and a taser hung. "I'm helping her," Ethan said quickly, holding up his hands. "She collapsed and—" "I don't need excuses, kid. Move back," the guard interrupted, his tone commanding. "She's pregnant," Ethan shot back, his voice cracking with frustration. "She needs help." The guard hesitated, his eyes flicking between Ethan and Maggie. Before he could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "Let the boy be." Ethan turned to see a tall man descending the steps of a nearby office building. His suit was impeccably tailored, and his presence commanded attention. He walked with purpose, his sharp gaze fixed on the scene. The guard stepped back, looking unsure. Mr. Lawson, he stammered, recognizing the man. Mr. Lawson knelt beside Maggie, his stern features softening with concern. Maggie, can you hear me? He asked gently. Her eyes opened slightly and her lips curved into a faint smile. Charles, she murmured. Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him. Whoever this man was, he clearly knew Maggie, and he could take charge now. But as he stood to leave, Mr. Lawson's eyes locked onto him. You were helping her? Mr. Lawson asked, his voice calm but probing. Yes, sir, Ethan replied. She fell, and no one was stopping, so... Mr. Lawson's gaze lingered for a moment. Then he gave a short nod. Thank you. Stay here until the ambulance arrives. Ethan hesitated. Part of him wanted to disappear back into the anonymity of the crowd, but something about Mr. Lawson's tone left no room for argument. He nodded and stepped back, watching as Mr. Lawson continued speaking softly to Maggie. Moments later, the distant wail of sirens broke through the ambient noise of the street. The ambulance pulled up and paramedics jumped out, quickly assessing Maggie's condition. Ethan stood awkwardly on the sidewalk, unsure if his role in this strange morning was over. As the paramedics loaded Maggie into the ambulance, Mr. Lawson approached him again. What's your name, son? Ethan. Ethan Coleman. Mr. Lawson extended a hand, his expression unreadable. Charles Lawson, thank you for helping my wife. Ethan shook his hand, surprised by the firm grip. I just did what anyone would have done, he said quietly. Mr. Lawson's gaze sharpened. Not everyone would have, Ethan. Before Ethan could respond, the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle sped off, leaving him standing alone on Cedar Lane, the weight of the morning's events pressing heavily on his shoulders. The ride back home from Cedar Lane felt surreal to Ethan. His fingers still tingled from the firm handshake of Charles Lawson, a man who had everything Ethan couldn't even begin to imagine. The sight of Maggie being taken away in the ambulance lingered in his mind. He kept replaying her weak smile and Charles's words, not everyone would have, over and over. Ethan wasn't sure if it was praise or a quiet judgment of the world they lived in. When Ethan finally stepped into his family's apartment, the reality of his own world hit him like a cold draft. The smell of reheated spaghetti filled the cramped space, mingling with the faint mustiness of old furniture. The walls, marked with scratches and peeling paint, bore the weight of years of struggle. Ethan, came his mother's voice from the kitchen. Hannah Coleman appeared, still in her work uniform, her eyes framed by dark circles that spoke of endless double shifts at the diner. You're home late. Everything okay? Yeah, Ethan replied, forcing a small smile. Just got caught up with something. He shrugged off his backpack, letting it slump against the wall. Where's Lily? In her room, homework, Hannah said, studying him, with that familiar maternal intuition. Caught up with what? Ethan hesitated. There was this woman. She collapsed on Cedar Lane. I stopped to help. Hannah's face tensed, her brows knitting together. Ethan, did you get involved with someone you shouldn't have? No, Mom, it wasn't like that, Ethan said quickly, his voice tinged with exasperation. She was pregnant and no one else was helping. What was I supposed to do, just walk away? Hannah sighed, leaning against the counter. I know you've got a good heart, Ethan, but you've got to be careful. People don't always see the good. They see what they want to see. Ethan clenched his jaw. I didn't do anything wrong. I'm not saying you did, Hannah said, softening her tone. But the world, it's not fair, especially for us. You've got to stay out of trouble. Trouble. The word lingered in the air as Ethan walked to his sister's room. It was always about avoiding trouble, wasn't it? He knocked lightly and peeked inside. Hey, Squirt, he said, stepping into the small room. Lily looked up from her notebook, her round glasses slipping down her nose. How's the math going? Terrible, she said, pushing the notebook away dramatically. Why do I have to know fractions anyway? I'm going to be an artist. Ethan chuckled and sat beside her on the worn bed. Even artists need to know how to split a pizza. Lily grinned, but her cough cut her laughter short. Ethan's smile faded as he handed her a glass of water from the nightstand. You feeling okay? I'm fine, Lily said, brushing it off like she always did, but Ethan noticed the faint wheeze in her breath, a sound that had become far too familiar. Mom says we're going to the clinic next week. Ethan said. Make sure everything's good. Lily rolled her eyes. It's just asthma. No big deal. But it was a big deal, to Ethan at least. Every cough, every inhaler puff felt like a ticking clock, counting down to something he couldn't control. He ruffled her hair. Don't worry, Squirt, we'll get it sorted. When he returned to the kitchen, Hannah was sitting at the table staring at a stack of unopened envelopes. The red lettering on one caught Ethan's eye. Final notice. How bad is it? Ethan asked, his voice low. Hannah glanced up, her expression weary. We've got a week to figure out the rent. I'll pick up an extra shift tomorrow. Ethan bit the inside of his cheek. You can't keep working yourself into the ground, Mom. What choice do I have? Hannah shot back, her voice cracking. She sighed and rubbed her temples. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to snap. It's hard. Ethan looked at the envelopes again, his mind racing. He thought of Maggie's fragile state, of Charles Lawson's expensive suit and commanding presence. Did they even know what it was like to worry about rent or groceries? A part of him burned with resentment, but another part, a quieter, more desperate part, wondered if meeting them could somehow change things for his family. I'll figure something out, Ethan said, more to himself than his mother. Hannah looked at him, her tired eyes filled with both gratitude and worry. You already do more than you should, she said softly. You're 16, Ethan. You shouldn't have to carry this. Ethan didn't reply. He couldn't, because deep down, he knew there was no one else to carry it. As the night deepened, Ethan lay awake in his small room, staring at the cracked ceiling. His mind drifted back to Maggie's weak smile and Charles's sharp, probing eyes. The contrast between their lives and his own felt like an unbridgeable chasm. And yet, for the first time, a flicker of something stirred in his chest, a strange mix of hope and fear. Maybe, just maybe, that morning on Cedar Lane had been more than just a coincidence. Ethan couldn't shake the image of the ambulance disappearing down Cedar Lane, carrying Maggie Lawson and the weight of that strange encounter. As he sat at the breakfast table the next morning, his mind wandered back to Charles Lawson's piercing gaze and the gravity in his handshake. For a moment, he wondered if his choice to help Maggie might ripple into something more. But then, life had never been kind enough for him to expect miracles. The shrill ring of the old landline phone broke through his thoughts. Hannah, still in her work uniform, grabbed the receiver with a sigh, muttering, "Probably another bill collector." "Hello?" she said, her voice guarded. After a brief silence, her expression changed, a mix of surprise and confusion. "Yes, this is Hannah Coleman. Who's asking?" Ethan leaned forward, curious. His mother's brow furrowed as she nodded along to the voice on the other end. "I see. No, he didn't mention that." "Yes, of course, thank you." She hung up, her hand lingering on the phone. "That was someone named Charles Lawson. He said he wants to meet us." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "What? Why?" "He said he's Maggie's husband. Wants to thank you for helping her." Hannah shook her head, her suspicion evident. "I don't know what kind of man calls out of the blue like that. Seems odd." Ethan thought back to Cedar Lane, the luxury SUV, and Charles's commanding presence. "Maybe it's nothing," he said, trying to sound casual. But deep down, a knot of anxiety formed. This wasn't just gratitude. It felt bigger than that. Later that afternoon, Ethan found himself standing in front of Lawson Enterprises, the tallest building in downtown Asheville. The glossy glass facade reflected the world back at him, making him feel small and out of place. Hannah stood beside him, her diner uniform freshly ironed, though the tired lines on her face betrayed her nerves. She carried Lily's inhaler in her purse, as if it were a shield against the unknown. "I don't like this," Hannah murmured, as they stepped into the pristine lobby. The faint hum of an air purifier mingled with the sound of polished shoes clicking against marble floors. "It'll be fine," Ethan said, though he didn't fully believe it himself. He tightened his grip on the straps of his backpack as they approached the receptionist. "Mr. Lawson is expecting you," the woman said with a practiced smile, gesturing toward the elevators. "Top floor." The ride up was silent except for the soft dinging of passing floors. Ethan felt his palms grow clammy as the elevator slowed to a stop. When the doors opened, they were greeted by a spacious office that felt more like an art gallery than a workspace. Expansive windows framed the mountains in the distance, while modern sculptures dotted the room. Charles Lawson stood by his desk, his posture rigid but his expression neutral. "Mrs. Coleman, Ethan, thank you for coming," he said, his voice smooth but firm. He extended a hand to Hannah, who hesitated before shaking it. "It's unexpected," she said, her tone guarded. "Why did you want to see us?" Charles gestured to the chairs in front of his desk. "Please, have a seat." Hannah crossed her arms, but Ethan nudged her gently, and they both sat down. Charles took a deep breath, as if weighing his words carefully. "My wife, Maggie, is doing well, thanks to you," he began, looking at Ethan. "She told me you didn't hesitate to help her when no one else would. That speaks to your character." Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I just did what anyone would have done." "That's where you're wrong," Charles replied, his tone sharpening. "Most people wouldn't have. And that's why I wanted to meet you." He turned to Hannah. "I understand times have been difficult for your family. I'd like to offer my support." Hannah stiffened. "We're not looking for charity, Mr. Lawson." "This isn't charity," Charles said firmly. "It's gratitude and an investment." He turned his gaze back to Ethan. "You have potential, Ethan. I see it, and I'd like to help you reach it." Ethan blinked, his mind racing. "What do you mean?" Charles leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "I want to offer you opportunities, a scholarship, mentorship, whatever you need to make something of yourself." Hannah's jaw tightened. "Why would you do that? You don't even know us." Charles hesitated, glancing at the window. "I've learned that sometimes life gives you rare chances to make a difference. Ethan saved my wife's life. This is my way of returning the favor." The room fell silent, tension thick in the air. Hannah looked at Ethan, her eyes searching his face for a sign of what he wanted. Finally she spoke, her voice quiet but resolute. "We'll think about it." Charles nodded, his expression unreadable. "Take your time. The offer stands." As Ethan and Hannah left the building, the weight of the meeting settled heavily on their shoulders. For Ethan, it wasn't just an offer. It was a doorway to a world he'd only ever seen from the outside. And yet stepping through it felt like a risk he wasn't sure he could take. The elevator ride down from Lawson Enterprises felt heavier than the one up. Ethan and Hannah barely spoke as they exited the building and stepped onto the bustling streets of downtown Asheville. The echoes of Charles Lawson's offer lingered between them, an unspoken weight pressing against their thoughts. "That man," Hannah began, her voice taut. "He has no idea what it's like to be us. No idea." Ethan walked a few steps behind, his gaze fixed on the cracks in the pavement. "He didn't have to offer anything, Mom. He could have just thanked me and been done with it." "Exactly," Hannah replied sharply, spinning to face him. "So why did he? People like him don't just hand out opportunities. There's always a catch." Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't. A part of him wanted to believe that Charles's offer was genuine, but another part, a louder, more cynical part, knew his mom might be right. Life didn't hand out favors without strings attached. Not to people like them. The next day, Ethan returned home from school to find his mother sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the phone with a mix of frustration and resignation. She glanced up as he entered, her lips pressed into a tight line. "He called again," she said simply. "Charles?" Ethan asked, dropping his backpack onto the floor. Hannah nodded, her fingers drumming against the table. "He wants me to come in tomorrow to discuss something about a job." Ethan's eyebrows shot up. "A job? What kind of job?" "I didn't ask," she replied, standing to pace the small kitchen. "I don't know what he's playing at, Ethan, but I don't like it. I've worked hard my whole life without anyone's pity, and I don't plan to start now." Ethan watched her closely. The defiance in her voice was real, but so was the exhaustion. He could see it in the way her shoulders slumped, the way her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the edge of the counter. "Maybe it's not pity," Ethan said quietly. "Maybe he's just trying to help." Hannah turned to face him, her expression softening. "I don't want us to owe anyone anything, Ethan. You understand that, right? I do, he said, meeting her eyes. But we can't keep going like this. Lily's getting sicker. The bills aren't stopping, and you're working yourself to the bone. What if this is a chance to make things better? For all of us. Hannah hesitated, her resolve wavering. She sighed deeply, running a hand through her hair. I'll go, she said finally, but I'm not promising anything. The following morning, Hannah stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her diner uniform nervously. It wasn't the kind of outfit she would have chosen for a meeting with a man like Charles Lawson, but it was the best she had. Ethan sat on the couch watching her with quiet encouragement. You look fine, Mom, he said, offering her a small smile. Just be yourself. Hannah gave a short laugh. Myself? The overworked waitress with overdue rent and a sick kid? Yeah, that'll impress him. Don't sell yourself short, Ethan replied. You're the hardest worker I know. Hannah gave him a look that was equal parts gratitude and disbelief before grabbing her coat. Let's get this over with. At Lawson Enterprises, they were greeted by Charles's assistant, a polished woman named Patricia, who led them into a conference room. The space was stark and professional, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city below. Charles was already seated at the head of the table, his posture as composed as ever. Mrs. Coleman, he said, rising to shake her hand. Thank you for coming. Hannah nodded stiffly, taking the seat he gestured to. Ethan sat beside her, sensing her unease but staying quiet. I won't waste your time, Charles began, folding his hands on the table. We have an opening in our building services team. It's an honest job, maintenance, cleaning, keeping things running smoothly. It comes with full benefits, including health insurance for your family. Hannah blinked, clearly caught off guard. Maintenance? She repeated, her voice cautious. Charles nodded. Yes, it's not glamorous, but it's steady work. And with your experience managing a household and working under pressure, I think you'd be a great fit. Hannah looked down at her hands, her mind racing. On the one hand, the offer seemed reasonable, practical even. On the other, it felt like charity disguised as opportunity. Why me? She asked finally, lifting her eyes to meet his. You could have given this to anyone. Charles held her gaze. Because I believe in rewarding the right people. Your son showed courage and compassion when it mattered most. This is my way of acknowledging that. Hannah's throat tightened, her emotions threatening to surface. She glanced at Ethan, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. I don't want a handout, she said quietly. I want to earn my way. And you will, Charles replied firmly. This isn't a favor, Mrs. Coleman. It's a job, one I believe you'll excel at. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words settling over them. Finally, Hannah exhaled slowly and nodded. All right, I'll take it. Charles's expression softened, and he extended his hand again. Welcome aboard. As they left the building, Hannah seemed lighter, though her steps still carried hesitation. Do you think I made the right choice? She asked Ethan. He smiled at her. Yeah, Mom, I think you did. And for the first time in a long time, the weight on their shoulders felt just a little bit lighter. The days after Hannah started her new job at Lawson Enterprises felt different in the Coleman household. There was a sense of cautious optimism, but it came laced with uncertainty. Ethan noticed the subtle changes in his mother, how she came home more tired than usual, but with a determination he hadn't seen in months. The job was physically demanding, yet it gave her a kind of pride she hadn't felt in years. Ethan had barely adjusted to this new normal when a call from Charles Lawson's assistant interrupted their quiet evening routine. The message was short. Maggie wanted to see Ethan at their estate. A car would be sent to pick him up the next day. Hannah looked skeptical. Are you sure about this, Ethan? You don't owe them anything. I know, Mom, Ethan said, gripping the edge of the counter. But maybe it's not about owing. Maybe it's just an opportunity to understand them better. The next afternoon, a sleek black sedan pulled up outside their apartment building. Ethan's nerves grew as the driver navigated the winding roads that led to the outskirts of town. When they finally reached the Lawson estate, his breath caught. The sprawling property looked like something out of a movie, with its towering gates, pristine gardens, and a mansion that seemed to stretch endlessly against the sky. Ethan stepped out of the car and followed the driver's instructions to the front door. Maggie herself greeted him, looking much healthier than she had on Cedar Lane. Her smile was warm, her movements graceful despite her advanced pregnancy. "Ethan," she said, her voice kind, "I'm so glad you came. Please come in." The inside of the house was even more overwhelming. Chandeliers hung from high ceilings and the walls were adorned with artwork that looked like it belonged in a museum. But what struck Ethan most was how quiet it was, eerily so, as though the house itself were too large to contain any real life. "Charles is out at the moment," Maggie said, leading Ethan into a sunlit sitting room. "But I wanted to personally thank you again for what you did. You didn't just save me, you saved our family." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, not knowing how to respond. "I just did what anyone would have done." Maggie's smile softened. "You keep saying that, but it's not true. Most people would have walked by. What you did took courage." Before Ethan could reply, another voice entered the room. "And now he's here to see what courage buys." Ethan turned to see a woman standing in the doorway. She looked to be in her late 40s, with sharp eyes and an air of confidence. Maggie's expression brightened. "Ethan, this is Margaret Lawson, Charles's sister." Margaret crossed the room and extended a hand. "I've heard a lot about you. You're quite the hero, aren't you?" "Not really," Ethan said, shaking her hand. He wasn't sure if her tone was teasing or genuine. Margaret settled into a chair across from him. "I'm sure this place must seem excessive to you," she said, gesturing around the room. "It does to me sometimes." "Margaret," Maggie said gently, a warning in her tone. "What?" Margaret said, shrugging. "It's the truth. This house, it's a fortress. It keeps people out, but it also keeps us locked in." She looked at Ethan. "Charles doesn't mean to come off as cold, you know. He just doesn't know how to connect anymore. Not since—" "That's enough," Maggie interrupted, her voice firm but kind. "We don't need to burden Ethan with our family's history." Ethan's curiosity flared, but he respected Maggie's boundary. Still, Margaret's words lingered. They painted a picture of a man who, despite all his wealth and power, seemed just as isolated as anyone else. Maggie stood, breaking the momentary tension. "Let me show you the garden. It's my favorite part of the house." Ethan followed her outside, where the manicured lawn stretched endlessly, dotted with vibrant flowers and perfectly trimmed hedges. It was beautiful, but it felt oddly artificial, like something designed to impress rather than comfort. Maggie sat on a stone bench and gestured for Ethan to join her. "I know all of this must seem overwhelming," she said. "But you should know, Charles wasn't always like this. He used to be softer, more open. Life has a way of hardening people." Ethan nodded, unsure of what to say. "It must be hard to live in a place like this," he said quietly. "It's so big." "It is," Maggie admitted. "But what makes it hard isn't the size. It's the silence." She looked at Ethan, her expression thoughtful. "That's why what you did means so much to me. You reminded Charles that not everyone out there is indifferent, that there are still people who care." Ethan glanced around the garden, the weight of her words settling in. For all their wealth, the Lawsons seemed trapped by grief, by loneliness, by walls both literal and figurative. And for the first time, Ethan realized that maybe, just maybe, his role in their lives wasn't finished yet. Ethan walked home from the Lawson estate that evening, his mind buzzing with everything he had seen and heard. The grand house, Margaret's sharp words, and Maggie's gentle gratitude all swirled together in a confusing mix of awe and unease. The Lawsons' lives might have been wrapped in wealth, but the isolation he had felt in that sprawling mansion stayed with him. For all their privilege, they were as trapped by their circumstances as his family was by theirs. The next morning, Ethan's walk to school felt unusually long. He kept his head down as he passed the usual landmarks, the corner store, the bus stop, the cracked sidewalk near the old bakery. But as he turned onto the school grounds, something felt off. Groups of students stood clustered together, their heads bent over their phones, their voices buzzing with excitement. "Hey, that's him!" someone whispered. Ethan stopped, his stomach tightening. He glanced around, catching a few familiar faces looking at him, then quickly looking away. Whispers rippled through the crowd. growing louder as he walked toward the main entrance. "Ethan! Yo, Ethan!" called a voice from behind him. He turned to see Marcus, a classmate from his biology class, jogging up to him with his phone in hand. "Man, you're famous. Check it out." "Famous?" Ethan repeated, confused. Marcus handed him the phone, and as Ethan stared at the screen, his heart sank. There it was, a video of him kneeling beside Maggie on Cedar Lane, helping her sip water as onlookers ignored them. The caption read, "Teen saves pregnant woman while others walk by." The video had thousands of views, hundreds of comments, and an overwhelming number of likes. Ethan's face burned as he scrolled through the comments. What a hero. Why didn't anyone else stop? This kid deserves some recognition. But not all the comments were kind, probably staged. Betty's looking for attention. Another kid trying to go viral. Ethan handed the phone back to Marcus, his chest tightening. Where did this come from? Someone in the crowd must have recorded it, Marcus said, shrugging. It blew up overnight. You're all over social media, man. Ethan muttered a quick thanks and hurried into the school building. As he walked down the hallway, the whispers followed him. Students stared, some smiling, some sneering, but all watching him like he was a curiosity on display. For someone who had spent most of his life trying to stay invisible, the attention was unbearable. By lunchtime, the pressure had reached its peak. Ethan sat alone at his usual spot in the cafeteria, hoping to avoid the curious glances and pointed fingers. But it wasn't long before Jonah and Kayla, two classmates he barely knew, plopped their trays down across from him. "Dude, you're all over my feed," Jonah said, grinning. "You're like a hero or something." Kayla nodded, her eyes wide with admiration. "It's so inspiring what you did. Maggie Lawson is like a big deal in this town. Did you know that?" Ethan stared at his sandwich, his appetite gone. "I didn't do it for attention," he said quietly. "Yeah, but still," Jonah said, oblivious to Ethan's discomfort. "People are talking about you, man. You should enjoy it." Ethan forced a tight smile, but inside, he felt like crawling under the table. He didn't want to be talked about. He didn't want to be seen. He just wanted his life to go back to the way it was before. After school, Ethan rushed home, hoping to escape the suffocating gaze of the world. But as he turned onto his street, he froze. A news van was parked outside his apartment building, its logo glaring in the afternoon sun. Two reporters stood near the entrance, their cameras trained on the doorway. Ethan ducked into the alley, his heart pounding. He pulled out his phone and called his mom. "Mom, there are reporters outside the building," he said, his voice shaking. Hannah sighed on the other end. "I know. They've been here for an hour asking about you. I told them to leave, but they won't listen." "I didn't ask for this," Ethan said, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't want any of this." "I know, sweetheart," Hannah said gently. "Just come home. We'll figure it out." When Ethan finally made it inside, his mom was waiting for him, her expression a mix of exhaustion and worry. "They'll go away eventually," she said, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "People always move on to the next big thing." Ethan nodded, but the weight of the day still pressed heavily on his chest. "I didn't help her for this, Mom. I just did what anyone should do." Hannah smiled softly, brushing his hair back. "That's exactly why it matters, Ethan, because you did it when no one else would." Later that night, Ethan lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The video, the reporters, the whispers at school. It all felt like too much. But then he thought of Maggie's smile, of the gratitude in her voice when she said he had saved her family. He thought of Lily and Hannah, and how everything he did was for them. Maybe he couldn't control what people said about him. Maybe he couldn't make the world see him the way he wanted. But he could control the kind of person he chose to be. And that, he decided, was enough. The following week passed in a haze of awkward stares and muttered comments. The viral video of Ethan's actions on Cedar Lane refused to fade from the public eye. Even at home, the phone rang constantly with reporters asking for interviews. Hannah did her best to shield Ethan, answering curtly before hanging up. But the tension in their small apartment grew heavier by the day. One afternoon, Ethan arrived home from school to find a familiar black car parked outside the building. His chest tightened as he climbed the stairs, half expecting another wave of reporters. Instead, Charles Lawson sat in their tiny kitchen, looking impossibly out of place in his tailored suit. He was talking to Hannah, who stood with her arms crossed, her face a mask of guarded suspicion. "Ethan," Charles said, standing as the boy entered. "Good timing. I was hoping to speak with you." Hannah gestured toward the chair opposite Charles. "He says he has another offer for you." Ethan's stomach churned as he dropped his backpack to the floor. "Another offer?" Charles nodded, his sharp gaze softening slightly. "I've been following the attention you've been getting. I know it hasn't been easy, but it's also made me think. You've shown extraordinary character, Ethan. You deserve a chance to build something for yourself." Ethan glanced at his mother, unsure what to make of the man's words. "What are you saying?" "I'm offering you a scholarship," Charles said simply. "Full tuition to one of the best private schools in the state. You'll have access to resources, mentorship, and a network that can help shape your future." Ethan blinked, stunned. He had barely scraped through public school, juggling homework with babysitting Lily and helping his mom manage the household. A private school wasn't just out of reach. It felt like an entirely different world. I don't think I can do that," Ethan said, his voice barely audible. "I can't leave my mom and Lily. They need me." "We'll manage," Hannah interrupted, surprising him. "If this is real, if it's something you want, we'll figure it out." Charles leaned forward, his tone firm but understanding. "This isn't just about academics, Ethan. It's about giving you a chance to be more than your circumstances. But it won't be easy. The scholarship is conditional. You'll need to maintain top grades and commit to extracurricular activities." Ethan frowned, his thoughts racing. "Why me? There are plenty of kids out there who could use something like this." "Because you've earned it," Charles said. "You stepped up when others didn't. That tells me you have something most people lack: initiative, integrity, and I want to help you develop that." The room fell silent, the weight of the offer pressing heavily on Ethan's chest. He could feel his mother's eyes on him, full of hope and worry. For years he had dreamed of escaping the cycle of struggle, but the thought of leaving his family behind, even partially, made his stomach churn. "What if I fail?" Ethan finally asked, his voice trembling. Charles's expression softened. "Then you try again. But I don't think you will. You've already proven you can rise to the occasion." Hannah reached out and placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "This is your decision, Ethan. Whatever you choose, I'll support you." Ethan looked at her, then at Charles, and finally at the worn linoleum floor beneath his feet. This was more than just an opportunity. It was a turning point, a chance to change not only his life but his family's future. Taking it felt like a risk, but not taking it felt like giving up. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'll take the scholarship." Charles nodded, a small smile breaking through his usually stoic demeanor. "Good. I'll have my assistant send over the paperwork. The semester starts in 2 weeks." As Charles stood to leave, he paused at the door. "This won't be easy, Ethan, but I believe you can handle it. And remember, you're not doing this alone." After he left, Hannah sat beside Ethan, her expression unreadable. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. "I know this isn't what you expected, but it's a chance most people never get." Ethan nodded, the reality of his decision slowly sinking in. He had just taken a step into a world he didn't fully understand, one that felt both exciting and terrifying. But as he looked at his mother and thought of Lily's laugh, he knew he had made the right choice. That night, Ethan sat at the small kitchen table long after his family had gone to bed. He pulled out an old notebook and began scribbling a list of goals. They were small at first: get through the first week, find a way to fit in. But as the hours passed, the list grew bolder. Graduate with honors, make his family proud, change the story of their lives. The path ahead felt uncertain, but for the first time, it also felt possible. The weeks leading up to Ethan's first day at Lawson Academy passed in a whirlwind of preparation and anxiety. His mother, though proud, worked harder than ever to make sure he had everything he needed, while Lily tried to lighten the mood with her usual jokes about him becoming fancy and proper. Ethan laughed along, but the knot in his stomach only grew tighter. The idea of leaving his family, even for a few hours each day, felt like a betrayal. When the day finally came, Ethan found himself standing in front of the sprawling campus, his backpack slung over his shoulder. The pristine lawns and towering brick buildings seemed worlds away from the creaky halls of his old public school. Everywhere he looked, students dressed in sharp uniforms moved with a confidence Ethan could only dream of. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. His first class was history, and as he entered the room, the conversations around him hushed. Whispers and curious glances followed him to his seat in the back. Ethan could feel the weight of their stares, the silent judgment in the way they appraised his thrift store uniform and scuffed shoes. The teacher, Mr. Avery, began the lesson, but Ethan found it hard to focus. His mind drifted back to Lily's cough that morning and his mother's weary smile as she urged him out the door. He clenched his pen tightly, trying to remind himself why he was here, to give them a better future. By lunchtime, the tension had only grown. Ethan sat alone at a table near the edge of the cafeteria, his tray untouched. Around him, clusters of students laughed and chatted, their easy camaraderie a stark contrast to his isolation. He pulled out a book, hoping to lose himself in the words, but the voices around him felt louder than ever. "Hey, you're the scholarship kid, right?" a voice said, breaking through his thoughts. Ethan looked up to see a boy about his age with neatly combed hair and a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah," Ethan replied cautiously. "I'm Caleb," the boy said, sitting down across from him, uninvited. "My dad's on the board. He mentioned you." Ethan's stomach churned. He didn't like where this was going. "Okay." Caleb leaned in slightly. "Don't get me wrong, it's cool that you're here. Just don't get too comfortable. This place isn't for everyone." Ethan clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around the edge of his book. "Thanks for the advice." Caleb shrugged, standing up. "Just thought you should know." With that, he walked away, leaving Ethan alone once again. That evening, Ethan returned home exhausted both physically and emotionally. His mother was waiting for him, her eyes lighting up when he walked through the door. "How was it?" she asked, setting a plate of reheated lasagna in front of him. "It was fine," Ethan lied, forcing a smile. He didn't want to burden her with his struggles, not when she was already carrying so much. But the truth was, the days at Lawson Academy only grew harder. The coursework was more demanding than anything he had faced before. And while his teachers were supportive, the unspoken divide between him and his classmates loomed large. Every group project, every lunchtime felt like a reminder that he didn't belong. Meanwhile, things at home were no easier. Lily's asthma had worsened, and while the new health insurance from Hannah's job helped cover the costs, the constant doctor visits and medications were a strain on everyone. Ethan found himself staying up late to finish assignments after long evenings of babysitting and helping his mom manage the household. One night, as Ethan struggled to keep his eyes open while reading a chapter on American political history, his mother sat down beside him. "You're pushing yourself too hard," she said gently. "I have to," Ethan replied, not looking up from his book. "If I mess this up, it's all over." Hannah placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice firm but kind. "You don't have to carry this alone, Ethan. We're a team, remember?" Ethan finally looked at her, the weight of everything catching up to him. "But what if I can't do it, Mom? What if I fail?" "You won't," Hannah said, her eyes steady. "Because you're not just doing this for us. You're doing it for yourself. And I believe in you." Those words stayed with Ethan long after she went to bed. He knew the road ahead wouldn't get any easier, but he also knew he couldn't give up. Not now. Not ever. The grueling pace of Lawson Academy and the demands of home had begun to weigh heavily on Ethan. Every day felt like an uphill climb, and though he pushed forward, doubt still lingered at the edges of his mind. His mother's encouragement kept him steady, and Lily's laughter, despite her worsening health, reminded him why he was fighting so hard. But even with these glimmers of hope, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to give. That moment came late one Friday evening, just as Ethan was finishing his homework. The sharp ring of his phone shattered the quiet of the apartment. It wasn't a number he recognized, but a sense of urgency made him answer. "Ethan, it's Margaret Lawson." came the voice on the other end, breathless and panicked. It's Maggie. She's gone into labor and it's too soon. Charles is a wreck and we need someone to keep him grounded. Can you come to the estate? Ethan's heart dropped. What? Me? What could I even do? Just be here, Margaret insisted. You have a way of calming people, Ethan. Trust me, he needs you. Ethan hesitated, glancing toward his mother who was sitting nearby, folding laundry. She gave him a questioning look. He covered the phone and explained quickly. Without hesitation, Hannah nodded. Go, she said. They wouldn't have called if it wasn't serious. The car that arrived to pick him up seemed to drive faster than usual, the city lights blurring into streaks as they raced toward the Lawson estate. When they arrived, the scene was chaotic. The front doors were wide open and voices echoed through the grand hall. Margaret met him at the entrance, her expression strained but relieved. She's upstairs. The doctors are with her, but Charles… She paused, her voice breaking. He won't leave the sitting room. He's pacing, snapping at everyone, and refusing to go to Maggie's side. I think he's scared. Ethan nodded, following her inside. He found Charles in the sitting room, his usually composed demeanor shattered. He stood by the window, staring out into the darkened gardens, his hands trembling. Mr. Lawson, Ethan said cautiously. Charles turned, his eyes red and weary. Ethan, what are you doing here? Margaret called me, Ethan replied, stepping further into the room. She thought I could help. Charles let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. Help? How can anyone help? The doctors don't even know if they can save her or the baby. Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of Charles's words pressing down on him. Maggie's strong, he said, his voice steady. She'll fight, and she needs you to fight with her. Charles shook his head, pacing the room like a caged animal. You don't understand. I've already lost too much. My parents, my brother, if I lose her too… His voice broke and he turned away, his shoulders shaking. Ethan hesitated, unsure if he should speak, but then he thought of his own family, of his father leaving, of his mother struggling, of Lily's fragile health. He knew what it was like to face loss, to feel powerless, and he knew what it took to keep going. You're right, Ethan said softly. I don't understand what you've been through, but I do know this. You can't let fear stop you from being there for her. Maggie needs you now more than ever, and so does your baby. Charles turned slowly, his expression raw. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just stared at Ethan as though searching for something. Finally, he nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. You're right, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I can't let her face this alone. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her eyes glistening with tears. Charles, the doctor said you can go in now. Maggie's asking for you. Charles straightened, his jaw tightening as he regained his composure. He glanced at Ethan, a flicker of gratitude in his tired eyes. Thank you, he said quietly before following Margaret upstairs. Ethan sank into a chair, the adrenaline fading from his body. The room was silent now, but the weight of the evening still hung heavy. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time since arriving, he felt a faint glimmer of hope. Hours later, as dawn broke over the estate, Margaret returned to the sitting room. Her face was weary, but her smile was genuine. The baby's here, she said softly, and Maggie's going to be okay. Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Relief washed over him, and for the first time in what felt like hours, he smiled. You did good tonight, Ethan, Margaret added, placing a hand on his shoulder. Charles isn't the type to say it outright, but he wouldn't have made it through this without you. Ethan nodded, his heart full. For all the challenges he had faced lately, this moment made it all feel worth it. He had found a way to help, not just Maggie and Charles, but an entire family struggling under the weight of their own fears. As he stepped outside into the fresh morning air, Ethan looked toward the horizon. The sky was streaked with gold and pink, a promise of a new day, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The sunrise over the Lawson estate was the most peaceful thing Ethan had seen in weeks. The golden hues spilling over the manicured gardens felt like a silent promise that the worst was over. Maggie and her newborn were safe, and for the first time, Ethan saw something in Charles Lawson he hadn't seen before. Gratitude without reservation. It was there in the man's handshake, in the way he had said, "Thank you, Ethan," with a depth that spoke volumes. But the events of that night weren't just a turning point for Charles. They were for Ethan, too. Returning home later that morning, he found his mother waiting for him in the kitchen, her expression a mix of relief and concern. "You were out all night," she said, handing him a plate of scrambled eggs. "Everything okay?" Ethan nodded, sitting down heavily at the table. "Yeah, Maggie had the baby. They're both fine." Hannah smiled, her shoulders visibly relaxing. "That's good to hear. You've been a big part of their lives, haven't you?" "I guess," Ethan said, taking a bite of his food. But even as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that his connection to the Lawsons had become something deeper, something more meaningful than he'd ever expected. Later that week, Ethan was back at Lawson Academy, slogging through another history class when the intercom crackled to life. "Ethan Coleman, please report to the headmaster's office." His classmates exchanged curious glances as Ethan packed up his things, ignoring the murmured comments that followed him down the hall. The summons felt ominous, but when he entered the headmaster's office, he was surprised to find Charles Lawson standing there, along with Margaret and the headmaster himself. "Mr. Coleman," the headmaster said, gesturing for Ethan to sit, "we wanted to speak with you about your contributions to this community." Ethan blinked, confused. "My contributions?" Margaret stepped forward, her smile warm. "You've done more than you realize, Ethan. Helping Maggie, supporting Charles during the crisis. You've been a pillar of strength when we needed it most." Charles cleared his throat, his expression serious but softened by the faintest hint of a smile. "It's not just about what you've done for my family, Ethan. It's about who you are, someone who steps up when others won't. That kind of character is rare and it deserves recognition." The headmaster nodded. "Mr. Lawson and the board have decided to establish a new community leadership scholarship in your name. It will support students who demonstrate exceptional integrity and a commitment to helping others." Ethan's heart stopped. "A scholarship? In my name?" "Yes," Charles said firmly. "It's the least we can do to honor everything you've done." Ethan stared at them, his mind racing. The idea of having his name attached to something so meaningful felt overwhelming, like a responsibility he wasn't sure he was ready for. But as he thought about his journey, the struggles, the sacrifices, and the moments of courage that had brought him here, he realized he couldn't say no. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice steady. "This means a lot." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change. The scholarship announcement brought a wave of media attention, but this time, Ethan was ready for it. With Charles's guidance, he learned how to handle the spotlight, using his newfound platform to talk about the importance of community and compassion. At home, life began to stabilize. Hannah's job at Lawson Enterprises became more than just a paycheck. It became a source of pride. Lily's health improved with better medical care, and the laughter in their small apartment became a little louder, a little freer. One evening, as Ethan sat at the kitchen table helping Lily with her math homework, Hannah set down a mug of tea in front of him. "You've come a long way, Ethan," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I'm so proud of you." Ethan looked up at her, his chest tightening. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom. Everything I've done, it's for us." Hannah smiled, brushing a hand over his hair like she used to when he was younger. "And you've given us so much more than I ever dreamed. Don't forget to be proud of yourself, too." The words stayed with Ethan long after she had gone to bed. He thought about the path he had taken, the moments of doubt, the times he wanted to give up, and the people who had helped him find his way. Charles, Margaret, and especially Maggie had shown him that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward, changing lives in ways he never expected. A few days later, Ethan returned to the Lawson estate for a small ceremony honoring the new scholarship. Maggie greeted him at the door, her newborn daughter cradled in her arms. "She's here because of you," Maggie said softly, her eyes glistening with tears. Our family is whole because of you. Ethan smiled, his heart full. I just did what anyone would have done. Maggie shook her head, her expression firm. No, Ethan, you did what most people wouldn't. As the ceremony began and the scholarship was officially announced, Ethan stood among the crowd, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building a future, not just for himself, but for everyone who had supported him along the way. The months following the scholarship announcement marked the beginning of a new chapter for Ethan and his family. Their small apartment, once a place of uncertainty and struggle, had transformed into a home filled with hope. The changes were gradual, but each step forward felt like a triumph. Hannah's job at Lawson Enterprises became a cornerstone of their stability. She worked tirelessly, her pride in her work reflected in the way she spoke about her day at the dinner table. Lily's health had improved dramatically with regular access to the medicine and care she needed, her laughter now a regular soundtrack in their lives. And Ethan, for the first time, felt like he was more than just surviving. He was thriving. But even as life settled into this new normal, Ethan couldn't ignore the desire to give something back. The scholarship in his name had been humbling, a testament to how far he had come. Yet he felt the need to root this journey in something tangible, something that symbolized growth and resilience. One Saturday morning, Ethan stood in the backyard of their building, a small tree sapling in his hands. The soil was hard and unyielding, much like the challenges he and his family had faced. He'd borrowed a shovel from a neighbor and spent the morning digging a hole deep enough for the sapling's roots. What's this? Lily asked, stepping outside with her inhaler in hand. It's a tree, Ethan said, brushing sweat from his forehead. I figured it was time we planted some roots of our own. Lily tilted her head, curious. Why a tree? Ethan knelt beside her, holding the sapling steady in the hole. Because trees take time to grow. They need care, patience, and a lot of effort. But when they grow, they become something strong and lasting, just like us. Lily smiled, handing him the small watering can she had brought with her. Together, they filled the hole, their laughter carrying through the crisp morning air. When the tree was finally secured, Ethan stood back, his chest swelling with pride. That's our tree, he said softly, resting a hand on Lily's shoulder. A reminder that no matter where we started, we can grow into something better. Later that day, Ethan returned to the Lawson estate for a meeting with Charles. The man had become more than a benefactor. He was now a mentor, and in many ways a friend. Maggie greeted him warmly at the door, her newborn daughter in her arms. Ethan, she said with a smile, she's awake if you want to say hi. Ethan peeked at the baby, marveling at her tiny fingers and wide, curious eyes. She's beautiful, he said. She's a fighter, Maggie replied. Like you. Ethan smiled, but before he could respond, Charles appeared in the doorway. Come on in, Ethan. We've got something to discuss. They settled in Charles's office, the large windows offering a view of the garden where Ethan had first realized the depth of the Lawson family's isolation. Now, the garden felt alive, vibrant with flowers and the sounds of birds, a reflection of the changes in the Lawson household. I've been thinking about your future, Charles began, leaning back in his chair. You've accomplished a lot, but I know you're capable of even more. What do you see for yourself, Ethan? Where do you want to go from here? Ethan hesitated, the weight of the question pressing on him. I want to make a difference, he said finally. For my family, for people like us who don't always get second chances. Charles nodded, his expression thoughtful. That's a good answer, and it's something we can build on. If you're interested, I'd like to continue supporting you. College, internships, whatever you need to achieve those goals. Ethan felt a lump in his throat. You've already done so much, Mr. Lawson. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. Charles's gaze softened. You already have, Ethan. You reminded me of what really matters. Family, community, and the power of kindness. That's more than enough. The drive home that evening was quiet. The city lights casting a warm glow over the streets. Ethan thought about how far he had come. From a boy who hesitated to step into a world he didn't belong to someone who had carved out a place for himself. His journey wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. Back at home, Ethan found his mother sitting on the couch, a book in her lap. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting up with a smile. "How was the meeting?" she asked. "It was good," Ethan replied, sitting beside her. "Charles wants to help me with college." Hannah's eyes glistened. "I'm so proud of you, Ethan. You've given us more than I ever thought possible." Ethan wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "We did this together, Mom, all of us." That night, as Ethan lay in bed, he thought about the tree he and Lily had planted. It would take years to grow, but that was okay. Just like his family's journey, it wasn't about rushing to the finish line. It was about the steady, patient work of building something lasting. And in that moment, Ethan realized that they had already planted the most important roots of all.